Good morning. This is Dr. Spencer Jordan, your instructor for Political Science 2241 for Troy University. I'm going to be starting on our Chapter 1 lecture on page 3 of your book, We the People. If you please follow along with me, I will go through the chapter in its entirety, and all PowerPoints and additional materials will be emailed to you for you to review along with the lecture so you can do the best you can possibly do in this course. Again, on page 3 as we begin. Our first chapter is Introduction to the Citizen and Government. What government does and why it matters. Let's talk about that just a second. What government does, it's a protecting device. It's a protection for all of us against each other, to be quite honest, because at the end of the day, people need rules and regulations. And we here in the United States have a special need, have a special area in which we look at government differently than many places around the world. And I think that's so very important as we move forward to understand that. In understanding that the American political system is radically different, it's because it's based on principles that have, my goodness, gone from generation to generation. From the time of the Mayflower Compact, all the way to the French and Indian War, to the American Revolution, all the way through the Civil War to today. Times have changed in America, but our bedrock principles have not. Now let's look on page 5 for just a few moments, and I think it's important enough that you know in each one of these chapters, you should be very aware that when you see the term key concepts, that you need to be aware to read those key concepts. Many of the illustrations and talking points that we'll have throughout the course are listed on these key concept areas. Now, let's talk about how the government affects the lives of each of us each and every day. Many of you probably recognize this. When we go and we drive back and forth to school or anywhere else, what do we see? We drive on a highway. We didn't pay for that highway individually for us to get from wherever we are to our schools. What that is there were tax dollars that went to that. And the accumulation of everyone and everyone's dollars went to help to pay for that road and highway. That's a basic premise of what our government services are and what they offer. It takes a collective will for us to make sure that the American political system works as we expect it to, from taxes, from taxation, to Social Security, to national defense, to janitorial services, to police and fire, all of those different types of things that we respond and rely on each and every day are so very valuable and important to us. So government affects our daily lives in ways that we take for granted each and every day. And I think it's important that we recognize that. Moving on over to page 6 and 7, I think it's important enough that you look at the figure 1.1, the graph there. And it goes on to say important life goals for college freshmen. And you can see you want to be, if you look at that graph, it says be very well off financial. Well, certainly all of us want to be able to do that. And that's an American concept, believe it or not. Because here in America, we believe in the free enterprise system. The free enterprise system is one in which, of course, we rely upon each person's individual needs and abilities to promote them both economically, socially, and in many cases politically as well. You could take the time to look on page 6 and 7 to see what daily schedules for freshmen would be and what their expectations would be for their future. Now on page 8 and 9, let's talk specifically about citizenship is based on political knowledge and participation. Probably all of you have learned in your political science courses this far, and especially in your government courses or civic courses you've had at your high schools, you've learned about the importance of democracy. Democracy meaning rule by the people. The term democracy comes from the Greek words, demos meaning population and krasi meaning rule. So I think that's important that we see that and we understand that that was a term that went from Greek to Roman times. And in our heritage, when our forefathers were looking to develop a specific type of economic or social, economic, and political system, they looked backwards. They looked to ancient Rome to see what was there. And of course, you probably remember through your history and your literature that, of course, ancient Rome and the Senate and Julius Caesar and all of those different people that you've read about in many of your readings that you've had from, oh my goodness, the many things that you learn about in your each and everyday lives come from the Roman culture. And much of what we have today in our political system was put together for the Romans and from the Roman experience. So I think it's important that we understand that, again, for us to be successful as Americans, we must have a working political knowledge. We must know a little bit about politics. You need to know who your representatives are. You need to know what the federal government means. You know, that's the national government. We'll talk a little bit about that later. You should also know a little bit about what our state government does. That's a different arm of the government. That is our local government. And of course, our local governments are a part of our state government. And that's what federalism is, shared power between the state and the national government, with, of course, the national government, i.e. the federal government, having power more over everyone, over the other branch, or not the other branch, I'm sorry, but the other realms at the state level. That's a difference between us and many other countries, that power is shared, but the supreme or central authority does rest with our national government in a federal type of system. Now, let's talk about citizenship a second. If you look on page 8, it says, today, voting is considered the building block of citizenship. I would encourage all of you, every child that's available, to please, at some time, place, manner, when you get to be 18 years old, go register to vote. It's the most important thing we can do as American citizens. You have a say, and your vote does matter. Go vote. Go vote. Be a good citizen. And you can see there in that paragraph above that on page 8, it says the complete person in Greek times was the public person, the citizen. The non-citizen or a private person was referred to as an idiotes. You don't ever want to be referred to as that, because basically we know what that means in our English language, don't we? So I think it's important enough for we to recognize, even as far back as the Greek and Roman period, people knew that you had to have participation in government for it to be vital, and a working understanding and knowledge. So I'm going to stress to each of you, know who your representatives are. Know what district, know what congressional district you're in. Know who that congressional district representative is. I live in the 6th District of South Carolina, and I know that James Clyburn is my representative. Well, I should know my 2 senators from every state. I should know the senator in the state of South Carolina General Assembly. You should know all of those things. Much less, we should always know at the national level who our president and vice president are, and the people who are in charge of both houses of Congress, both the House and the Senate. And you should also know a little bit about those political things that we call parties, political parties, groups of people who push an agenda and try to get people elected. That's so very important. We have Republicans and Democrats as our 2 major parties, and we also have third parties as well, things like the Green Party, Independence Party, and so on and so forth. But as we move forward on page 9, government is made up of the institutions and procedures by which people are ruled. Remember, if we did not have government, people would take advantage of each other. It's just a common theme of the human species. So I think it's important enough that we understand those types of common themes. Also on page 9, let's talk very briefly about different forms of government and how they're defined by power and freedom. Now, we're going to talk about several different types. First, we're going to talk about authoritarian, and then we're going to talk about totalitarian, and then we're going to talk about democracy and a constitutional government. First, let's talk about authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is a type of power system, meaning that government recognizes no formal limits, but may nevertheless be restrained by the power of other social institutions. I would say that if you looked at an authoritarian type of government, that would be a government in which certain smaller social groups make a big difference in how the government interacts with the people. But nonetheless, the government has authority over the people, i.e. listening to those people on a more brief type of manner. Now, totalitarianism is different. Totalitarianism, where is where the government has total control of all of the decisions that go on by government. A great example of totalitarianism would possibly be the Nazi regime during the 30s and 40s of Adolf Hitler. The evil regime there that was responsible for the Holocaust and many other issues that came about that spurred on World War II and the genocide of so many innocent people because of that. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, that was a communist country. Communism is an economic system, of course, but he had totalitarian type of authority, which means the government had total control over everything. Now here in the United States, we like to say we live in a democracy. A democracy is a political system where popular wishes are preferenced regularly in systematic shapes to help control the government from the government and what the government does. Now, we're not a true democracy because there are two types of democracy. You have a representative democracy where you elect representatives to vote for you, and a direct democracy, a democracy in which everyone votes on everything. Now, you can see here in the United States with 325 million people, and of course not that many eligible voters, but what would happen if we had to vote on everything? If we had to vote on what the speed limit was going to be on the highway in front of your house, to who's going to get what appropriations of money to build different projects. Those types of things would be practically impossible as we move forward as Americans. So I think it's important that we understand there are two types of democracies. Again, representative, which is the form of government we have in the United States, which was also the form of government in ancient Roman times, and direct democracy, which is something that was in the Greek times and the Greeks experimented with more than 2,000 years ago. And of course, a constitutional government. Constitution is just basically a fancy word for a set of guidelines for the government to go by. And that's really all it is. Now, we here in the United States, our U.S. Constitution is the greatest written work other than the Bible, period, bar none. That is my interpretation, and that is my firm belief. The United States Constitution is, again, the greatest governmental piece of work ever, and it has shown its diligence in tests of time and how it's persevered. Some people say that the Constitution is a living document; it lives and breathes. I'll let you make that interpretation. For me personally, because there are two different stances on the Constitution, but for me personally, I think the document is what the document is. It's the words and how you define those words. And we have a Supreme Court and a judiciary system that must go by that type of system that is outlined in the Constitution. And we'll be talking about the Constitution in great depth a little later on. So a constitutional government is set up to see how the Constitution affects our daily lives. What rules, what can the government do, and what can the government not do? What powers are delegated to what branches of government? And we know there are three branches of government in our type of governmental system that we have here in the United States. Our executive branch, which is our president. We'll talk a little bit more about the executive branch and agencies and our bureaucracy. We'll talk about the legislative branch, which is our House and Senate, which makes the laws, of course. And while I'm here at this particular point, let me add to this that all bills that deal with appropriation must originate in the House of Representatives. That's a key question later on. And of course, our Constitution, midterm and final exams. And of course, our Senate, which is the upper chamber. And they have different terms. We'll talk about those terms and why those came about as well. But a constitutional government is one that is set out rules and boundaries. And we here in the United States were the first constitutional government to practice that. Of course, there are many others around the world today. But here in the United States, we should be very proud that our document has lasted since 1787. Now, if you look on page 10 and 11, you can see that outline of authoritarian and totalitarian governments. I think it's important that you read that on page 10. And on page 11, there's limits of government encouraged freedom. Limits on government encouraged by our people here in the United States, by our citizenry. We want to make sure that government to some degree is limited. We do not want nor strive for our government to be all seeing and all being for everything. I think that's really important for us to understand that in this political process. And of course, expansion of political participation in the United States has changed the political balance. Of course, we can all recognize that many things have changed in the United States since its inception in 1776 and since the ratification of the Constitution. We can see, if you look on page 12 and 13, you can see how the identity of the United States has changed, partly because of the immigration that has occurred over all of these years. As you can see, I think there's some stunning statistics that you can look at on page 12 on those last two paragraphs. United States population was 3.9 million in 1790, and of course today it's almost 325 million people. Our identity has changed because, as we recognize from the colonization of what was the English colonies, which became the United States of America, we understand that it was generally people from Western Europe, Great Britain in particular. But those types of things have changed over time, and that has affected how and what our governmental system is. Now, you can also look there on page 12 is where it talks about representative democracy and a republic. And a republic is where, of course, a system that permits citizens to vote directly on policies and procedures, like what we talked about as a direct democracy. And that republic form is just basically where people vote for representation, people to represent them, and that's a great thing to be able to do. And then if you don't like what your representative does, every 2 or 4 or 6 years, you vote them out of office. That is what we do here in the United States, and that is what makes our governmental system so very special. If you look on page 13, it talks about immigration and increasing ethnicity and diversity. I think it's really important that we see that our country has changed since our inception, with immigration both from Western Europe, from Southern Europe, from Eastern Europe, from the Far East, and of course we can't forget about the Civil War and when slaves were given the right to vote, and of course were brought over here as enslaved African Americans. All of those different attributes have changed our identity and are continuing to change our identity even today. Probably if any of you look at the national news, we can all recognize the fact that immigration and immigration policies are really a dividing factor in our political system today. One in which I would strongly suggest that you get a handle on, you read about, you research. Immigrants from Latin America, Mexico, South America are changing what our dynamics are in our country. So I think it's really important that we recognize those facts as well. And of course, our second factor on page 14 be changing government criteria for racial classifications reflect American change in identity. Certainly, we can all reflect that even just a short 20 or 30 years ago, racial differences were much greater here in the United States. And I think it's important enough that we recognize that although we've made great strides in racism here in the United States, we've still got a long way to go. And I think that's important enough for us to understand that and try to cope with that as Americans as we move forward in a very, very divisive country that we live in this period of time. And then, of course, the third factor I'd like to talk about is today the country still confronts the questions of who we are as Americans. Although we have the greatest written document that rules us, our U.S. Constitution, sometimes we really strive to find who we are, what we mean, what does it mean to be an American. I won't get into a political spectrum here, but I will tell you, you need to have an understanding. You need to have a working knowledge of what it means to be an American and why that's so very important that we all celebrate on the frameworks and bedrock principles that our founders gave us as to why we are Americans. Why should you be proud to be an American? Why should you celebrate Americanism? Why should you celebrate democracy? What's the difference between socialism, capitalism, and communism? What does it mean to be in a representative democracy? All of those things are radical, not necessarily radical questions, but questions you need to ask, because radicals throughout our country strive on the lack of knowledge and lack of participation in our political system to get their points of view be brought forward. So it's your responsibility and my responsibility as good citizens to not only move forward as an understanding and have a working knowledge of our governmental systems, but to also move forward as participants in that system as well. Now, I'm on page 17 right now, and I'd like to talk specifically about America is built on the ideas of liberty, equality, and democracy. Now, what does liberty mean for us? I'm going to take that opportunity on page 17 to read that. It says, for Americans, liberty means freedom from government control and also economic freedom. In other words, you can be what you want to be, which is totally different than what in the former Soviet Union and in communist countries, they tell you what you're going to be. You take tests and they move you through a system that the government tells you whether you can go to 2-year college, go into the workforce, go into 4-year college, or be moved forward in whatever economic strata that you have. Here in the United States, you have to determine that. You determine that by your hard work, your effort, and your sacrifice. And I think that's so very important. That is a structural portion of who we are as Americans that we should never forget. And of course, limited government. Much of our American political system is based on limited government. Way back in 1776, when the first shots of the Revolution occurred, we were consumed as English colonies, as the American colonies, to not want Great Britain to tell us what to do. That Parliament was in London, and that was 3,000 miles away, and we had become self-reliant, and we understood that, and we didn't like people coming in and telling us what to do, especially a monarchy from across the ocean. And that was a bedrock principle for us to move forward as Americans. So I think when we talk about American political system, we should talk about limited government and understand what limited government is. Now, and that is, of course, one of the major principles of being an American citizen is that of limited government, which is something that our political parties in today's world have two different trains of thought on, and you need to investigate that as we move forward. Now, one of the things that we talk about, you've probably heard this in your civics classes as well, is laissez-faire. Laissez-faire literally means to leave alone. In other words, people don't want the government into their actions. People want to make decisions based on what's best for them, but with limitations to not hurt other people or take advantage of other people within our society. Laissez-faire capitalism is a structural type of capitalism where we believe that we should be able to make our own money, develop jobs, businesses, and those types of things that will promote our economic well-being and with limited government interaction. I think that's very important. Now, we should also at this time talk about, as we talk about laissez-faire, we should also know that equality and opportunity should occur in our American system. That is probably something that's changed since the 1700s, to the 1800s, to the 1900s. Now we are in the 2000s. I think it's really important that we understand that equality and opportunity, you can't discriminate against people and should not discriminate against people based on their color, their creed, their national origin, or anything else for that fact. I think that's really important that we move forward and we understand that people can freely move up and down the economic spectrum in the United States, not based on their economic system, not based on their skin color, not based on their gender, but primarily based on that person's work ethics. I think that's really important. And I think it's also, we understand about political equity. Political equality and equity is simply this, that everyone has equal opportunities, that we allow people to vote, that voting is not discriminated against, that if you go through the right process in each state, and each state, by the way, does have the ability to make that process what they think it should be. In terms with the Constitution, of course, one of the amendments we'll be talking about here shortly talks about that specifically as well. 18 years old and must be a citizen, and so on and so forth. I think it's important that anyone can get into the American political system. All you have to do is have a voice and want to be a leader, which is very difficult in the society that we live in today. A third different concept I'd like to talk about is what democracy means, that what the people want matters. We have something in our country today. It's called popular sovereignty. We have a general election each year. That's a presidential election. It's every 4 years. Our next election will, of course, be in 2020. And you know what? It's really important that the people get to vote for our president. We will talk specifically about some of things that have changed from how the Electoral College works to do you actually vote for president? Do you vote for electors for your state to vote? There's some pushback in our country even today for us to be able to roll back the Electoral College. We'll talk about small states and large states and the implementation that goes on with that. But I think it's important that we understand that American political system is based on popular sovereignty. People having the right to choose their government and the people that govern them. And then, of course, I think there's another major rule that I think we need to understand. American democracy rests on the principle of majority rule with minority rights. What that simply means is the party that's in power or the people you elect, they're in power. It's majority rule. Whoever gets the most votes. But we should never, ever infringe upon minority rights. Now, that doesn't mean that the minorities, the people who don't get the most votes, Republicans or Democrats, whoever's in the minority at that time, that they're trampled upon. You always must look out for those minority rights to make sure that their rights aren't trodden upon, but to keep in the concept that elections do have consequences. And when the majority rules, that's what we go by here in the United States, that political premise. So I think that's really important. Now, I do want to talk about American political values conflicts. Sometimes some people don't want. They would like to hone down these values that we have. And sometimes we would like to prop other values related to minority rights. We know about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 1968. I think those are two huge pieces of legislation that occur to help stomp out discrimination in our country. And of course, the Americans with Disabilities Act that occurred in the early 1990s to make sure that no one in our country was discriminated against people based on a potential disability that they have. So again, we as Americans, we have some conflict sometimes with what's best for us individually while making sure that we don't infringe upon minority rights. That pretty much brings us to an end of chapter 1. What I would like for you to do is look on page 22 and 23. Again, just a helpful hint, you should always go over the practice quiz at the back of the chapter. You will see that many of the quiz questions we'll have each week will come from that particular area of your text. And of course, the key terms, that's vitally important. So when you do have those tests, and you do have a certain day that you have to turn those tests back into us, please make absolutely sure that you've gone over these two particular areas because it's so important to you. Once again, this is Spencer Jordan. This is the conclusion of Chapter 1 lecture, and I look forward to seeing you again as we complete the Chapter 2 lecture later on. Thank you and have a great day.